that you don't put your microphone on mute so that I can yell at you and say, "Will you please turn that microphone off?"
Sure. Here we go then.
Here we go. Oh! Yeah. This whole deck is rocking. Oh God!
Good morning, Timothy. And good morning to everybody watching us on YouTube, also LinkedIn, Facebook, listening to us in Clubhouse. Thank you for joining us. This is Sunday morning, 8:20, the Japanese Politics One-on-One show with Timothy Langley, the CEO of Langley Esquire. Today we're here for the 143rd time, and before I pass the mic to Timothy, I would like to say thank you very much to everybody who has shared this post on LinkedIn so that it gets more visibility. If you want to do it to do so from now on, please do it, and we'll be once again delighted to see that. So Timothy, the floor is yours. I'm not going to keep anybody waiting because everybody wants to listen to you, hear what you have to say. Okay.
Thank you very much, Maya, and a special shout out to Remy and to Tom for sharing the URL for this briefing, because that really helps us. I mean, comments and likes are really nice too, but if you proliferate by sharing it with your network as well, it really boosts our audience, and I really appreciate that. Thank you very much. Today is November 5th, as Maya said, 143 Sundays together. Come rain or shine, or wherever the hell I am, it's always right here for you. So this is our briefing today, and according to the recommendations that Maya's gotten from you, we try and compress this briefing in very tight, maybe 30-35 minutes, and then open it up to Q&A. So I'd like to just tell you that I'm here in Hota Harbor. The harbor is full of boats of various sizes. Probably the smallest one is mine, barely staying afloat. But it's a 3-day weekend. Culture Day was on Friday. A lot of people are out. The weather has been just fantastic, and hopefully it kind of boosts the spirit of the country. Otherwise, Prime Minister Kishida is having a bit of a hard time. You know that he opened the diet session 3 weeks ago, and he's been promoting this supplementary budget that he was going to offer to the entire nation. He did that on Thursday. That was the date that he and Komeito, the LDP and Komeito, already banged out among themselves, because they are the administration, they are the leadership of the country. They banged out their economic plan, including subsidies and an extraordinary budget surplus, an extraordinary supplementary budget, and they offered that open to the rest of the diet, and you're going to hear that throughout this next week. So during this week, everybody was anticipating that the Prime Minister is working on this economic budget plan, and he was being peppered. He was being peppered not just by the opposition parties, the Constitutional Democratic Party, Ishin, and the likes, but also by his own party. Hiroshi Sekko, who is the leader within the Abe faction for the upper house. So he's an upper house member. He's very influential, and he pretty much lambasted. Can you turn your mic off, please, Maya?
Absolutely, yes.
Thank you. I get one in. He actually went on the floor of the budget committee room to sort of lambast the Prime Minister. This is very rare. Within the LDP, the largest faction, Mr. Kishida is the 4th largest faction, and telling him, that people have lost faith in your leadership, and they're not really sure which way you're leaning. We've heard these pronouncements about what you're expecting to do with tax cuts, with subsidies, with cash handouts, and the public and the LDP, we're a bit mystified by what you actually plan to do, because you say things and then putting them together, when they come together, they don't really make a lot of sense. So this is really huge. The Prime Minister received a recommendation from the very powerful tax committee. So the tax committee is a a coalition of the LDP leaders, people in the industry, people in the various ministries to put together a tax policy and make a recommendation to the Prime Minister. And it turns out that before he launched his speech on Thursday, he kind of pushed their recommendations aside and came up with his own plan. And that really upset the boat. And I think a lot of people, it hasn't really filtered out much to the public yet, but within the LDP, I think people are really becoming wary of this Prime Minister. So he had this great speech and talking about the subsidies and talking about the tax allotments and the tax cuts and that sort of thing. And then he left for 3 days of international travel. He went to Manila. I think he is in Malaysia today. There's 2 different summits. There's the summit in the Philippines, that was on Friday and yesterday. And then he went to Kuala Lumpur for a Malaysia summit, for the Japan-Malaysia summit. And he will come back to Tokyo tonight. And then fireworks will begin on Monday. So you can expect a very robust political week this next week, where kind of the knives are coming out, and the Prime Minister said he's going to give subsidies, he's going to give cash handouts to the people who are below a certain economic level, maybe Yonmayan, 40,000 yen, up to 70,000 yen. It's not a whole lot for a boost, but it's something. And in fact, the entire supplementary budget exceeds, what is it? Maybe a 3 point, I've got the number here, 13.1 trillion yen. And that's a lot of money, but you'll remember that this time last year, they had a supplemental budget, was the supplemental budget of the mother of all supplemental budgets, and that was 36 trillion. And the reason for that was to account for COVID and getting the country back on track. And I had expected and anticipated something along that number, some really huge number to kind of boost the economy and give people more hope and vitality. The wages aren't increasing. The only time the wages can really substantially increase is during the spring offensive. That's in May or June of this next year. And so the Prime Minister did talk about that. He said, you know, in May or June, we want the spring offensive to really come up and really reward the working class with higher wages. But that's down, you know, that's 6-7 months from here. So I think people are, you know, thinking about what he is proposing and the impact of that. It's not today, it's not now, it's not going to happen in a way that really boosts the economy in a meaningful way until further down the line. And he keeps kicking that ball down the field. So he is generating a little bit of animosity, unfortunately, and the fact that he made this huge pronouncement and then he's gone for 3 days and back on Monday. So Monday's going to be very active. His approval ratings also continued. Is this wind okay, Maya? I'm getting a lot of wind, but I think my fuzzy mic is probably protecting that.
Yes.
It's good? Okay, thank you.
Yes, doing its job.
Thank you, great. So I lost my train of thought. What were we talking about?
Well, talking about, I lost the train of thought.
You lost it too. So the stupid wind just broke my train of thought. I apologize for that.
Sorry, supplementary budget. And
the supplementary budget and the Prime Minister's, yeah, this next week is going to be a tough week for him, and there'll be a lot of news that's going on there. His approval ratings now, some are putting it at about 26% approval ratings. That's what we're talking about. And the more conservative newspapers, the larger ones that the government has more influence in, are putting his numbers at about 32%, which is, I think, a little bit too generous. So within the LDP, you're seeing his numbers really beginning to tumble, and that will spill out into the public in the next couple of weeks as he's put on the hot seat in the budget committee room to explain how he decided to reduce taxes, but he's going to continue to spend so much money on defense and on child rearing. So these are the two big ticket items that the Prime Minister has really put a stamp on. We're going to increase the spending for the military budget so that we can keep on par and we can defend the nation. And for the child rearing initiatives, this is fabulous, isn't this? And the child rearing and the supplements for families who are raising children, it continues to increase. And everybody's just scratching their head. If you're cutting taxes so that people have a little bit more wealth and they're trying to keep up with inflation, which you're not really doing that much about, how do you anticipate cutting the taxes and then spending all of this money? It just doesn't make sense, and he's really getting hammered by that. The other thing that's hammering this prime minister is that you recall he reshuffled his cabinet about, oh gosh, it was six or 8 weeks ago, and now the repercussions of that are beginning to come out. There are 2 vice ministers that have resigned over the last 2 weeks. This is pretty impactful for a new cabinet reshuffle. They're not cabinet ministers, they're vice ministers, parliamentary vice ministers, but still it's pretty important, and it reveals a lot of things that kind of go on in the background. If you were attending our briefing last week, Yayoi Kimura was the mayor for Kotoku, one of the 23 wards of Tokyo. She was a member of the lower house for 2 terms. She decided to run in Kotoku as a mayor, and she won. And then it turns out that she was a little bit loose with the campaign funding. She hired a company to promote her on YouTube. She spent about 140,000 yen to do that, which is less than, it's about $1,000, to run an ad for 10 days. Vote for me, I'm great. Look what I'm going to do for the citizens of Koto Ward. And it turns out that that was not quite right. It was actually a violation of the election campaigning laws. And it turns out under investigation that this recommendation, so when we had this briefing last week, several people commented to us, doesn't she have staff that tells her, that knows what the law is on that? And it actually is a little bit worse than that, that she received the recommendation to try this YouTube channel by one of the vice ministers. This is Mr. Kakizawa Mito. And Kakizawa Mito is a member of the lower house. He's been in the Diet for 5 terms, 52 years old. And he not only recommended to her staff that you should try this campaign because I think it would be effective, he was the vice minister for justice. Okay, so he was newly appointed in justice to be, one of the law keepers within the lower house and also just supporting the prime minister's cabinet. And he recommends to Miss Kimura, why don't you try this? And it falls on deaf ears. But he was also being lambasted for a lot of other things. So if once you get into trouble, once Bunshun or somebody identifies you as somebody of a person of interest, you've got a little bit of a scandal, kind of the aroma is beginning to come up. They come at you from all different angles, and that's what happened with Mr. Kakizaki. So Mr. Kakizawa. So not only was he resigned from his position, but they also kicked him out of the LDP. He's no longer an LDP member. This is really stunning. It's a huge blemish on him. He's not in the LDP. He was a 5-term member of the lower house. He's now without the LDP. He was appointed as vice minister without a faction. So he didn't have a faction affiliation. He was one of the independents who was appointed by the prime minister. And I think what this tells you is that the prime minister, in his rush to kind of appease and to show a fresher face, didn't quite run his due diligence as snappily as he should have. The other vice minister to bite the dirt was Education and Cultural Vice Minister Yamada Taro. He's 2 terms, 55 years old. He's in the upper house, and he had to resign because of a little bit of a picadillo with some young lady. And so he was filmed going into a hotel, and then this lady was going in, and it's been going on for quite a while. he is married, and so he was criticized as being the vice minister for education and culture of leading this lifestyle. And in fact, like I said, it comes from different angles. Not only was he filmed and criticized for having an extramarital affair while he's a parliamentary vice minister, but also there is the suggestion that maybe he paid this woman for this, spending time with him, and that would equal prostitution. So in true fashion, the magazines went after her. They had an interview with her. She, kind of gave them a discussion about the relationship between her and the vice minister, and it began to tumble very, very quickly. The police are still investigating whether it's a prostitution charge as well, so they're working on that. So it is not looking too great for the prime minister at this particular point in time. He's fighting on a lot of different angles. We're going to continue to watch this. It's a bit of a scandal, and I apologize if it's offensive to people, but scandal plays an important role in Japanese politics. It's inevitable. He's lost 2 vice ministers. This time last year, he lost 4 cabinet ministers, and still he's standing as the prime minister. So this sort of thing, it's maybe suggestive of something more going on. I kind of don't think so. I think the ministers are probably standing firm, and he's now in the extraordinary session, which will end in December 13th. They're going to pass this extraordinary supplementary budget during this extraordinary diet session. So it's slated to be 13 trillion yen. It might increase, it might decrease. Different allotments might go in different places based on the politics that goes on now. It's like they say, you love to eat sausage, but you don't like to see it made. That's what's happening now until the 13th, when this budget will be passed. We'll continue to watch that and report to you. Secretary of State Blinken is in Tokyo on, I think, Tuesday of this week. There is a group of 7 foreign ministers meeting on Tuesday here in Tokyo. He will be joining that. He's just on a round the world trip. He's been in Israel and Jordan. I think you've probably followed that and read that. But he's on this hopscotch trip. He hasn't been back home, I don't think. He's leaving Jordan. He's coming to Japan. He'll be in South Korea, then India, and then return back home. So he is really, really busy, and there's a lot going on in Israel that's influencing not just the U.S.-Japan dynamic, but also the Japanese dynamic. The foreign minister from Japan, Ms. Kamikawa, also visited Jordan and Israel. She was somehow successful in getting released some of the people who were held within Gaza and their families. So the story there is that there are people, Japanese people, who are married to Gazians, and maybe they live there or they're visiting their family. And as a result of this conflict, the Japanese citizens and their families wanted to get the hell out of this war zone, and it took a lot of negotiation. But maybe 10 families were removed this last week. The self-defense forces sent a second flight to Israel to pick up these people. Not the 10 families. I think they went to Egypt, and they're having a different way to come out. But the self-defense forces flew a second flight into Israel, and they got 20 Japanese this time, 15 South Koreans, 4 Vietnamese, and a couple of other people that they've flown out. And this time they went to Tokyo. If you've been following our report on this, last week we reported that the self-defense forces flew into Israel. They removed maybe 20 Japanese nationals. They flew them to a nearby country. They got off and they charged them some yen, 30,000 yen, for the pleasure of being rescued by the self-defense forces. At the same time, the South Korean airlines went to Israel as well. They flew about 160 people back, maybe 25 or 30 Japanese there. They flew everybody back to South Korea for free. And this just growing warmth and generosity between Japan and South Korea continues to really develop, and it's a nice thing to see. It's just to put in context, the Japanese flying the self-defense forces to a nearby country and charging the people for that, and the South Koreans doing it like 10 times bigger, 10 times better, flying them all the way to South Korea. It's just an interesting observation. What else do we have going on? The yen. You can't have a talk about Japanese politics without talking about the yen. The yen exceeded 152 yen to the dollar. Oh my God, that is really outstanding. The last time this happened, the Japanese, the Ministry of the Ministry of Finance jumped in. They put in, what did they put in? They put in like $60 billion. They pumped $60 billion into the economy by propping up the yen. This is a tremendous amount of money. If there has been no sign that they've done this yet, but the yen did exceed 152. There was a lot of pronouncements. This was triggered by some kind of deft moves by the Bank of Japan. You know, Kazuo Ueda is the new Bank of Japan governor, and he's been very careful about what he says and what he does with regard to tweaking the economy here. The yield on the bonds, the 10-year bonds, he's tweaked that a little bit. The Japanese banks, in lockstep order, they've also increased the amount of interest that you will be paid for deposits in the Japanese banks. And it was a massive increase. So you've got to pay attention to this, take this down as a note. They went from the deposits, if you're depositing a large amount of money in any of these Japanese banks, a 10-year yield, they went from a 0.01% of an interest rate return on the money that you've put in there to a 0.1%. So that's a factor of 10. But can you imagine, you know, this is kind of explains why people are putting their cash in their futons and their mattresses, because you put it into a bank, it really doesn't generate much interest. The markets are supposed to be doing a much better job at that. The markets in Japan compared to the United States, the yield for Japanese issued bonds and the treasury bonds is so different. So a lot of money is going to the United States rather than coming to Japan. And a lot of the investors in the United States treasury market are Japanese investors, and that's why the Bank of Japan issues these bonds and the Japanese government purchases them. So the regular market isn't going to assume that kind of profit potential on long-term 10-year bonds if they can get it elsewhere. So he began to tweak that a little bit. The yen took off on that, went to 152, came back down. Today it is at 149.37 dollars to the yen. And there is speculation now that it could go even higher once this gap is broken, and the trade figures are kind of supporting that. It could be a really bad spell for the Japanese yen and for the Japanese consumers. The Japanese big company exporters, on the other hand, are having a heyday. So the price of the yen being higher, meaning that the yen is weaker, products that are sold in Japan appear to be cheaper. People who come into Japan with dollars and they're trying to buy things, they're going to hotels, they're eating out. The perception is, and the reality is, that things are much cheaper here than they normally were. And if you've been, you know, a Japanophile or a Japan hand for, you know, anything beyond 15 years, you know that Japan used to have a reputation of being extremely expensive, and it just kept people away. And that's not the problem that Japan has now. Japan is sucking in lots of foreign tourists. People are coming in, they're buying lots of bonds, they're buying lots of companies, and it's just not the Western countries that are doing that. The value of the yen is spread out throughout the world as being very low in value. So the Japanese manufacturers, the 10 top Japanese manufacturers, are going to bring in 1.4 trillion yen in profit this year because of the yen value. So that equates to about $9.3 billion just among the top 10 exporters, Toyota being the biggest. And Toyota, as you know, is, I mean, the Japanese economy is based so largely, sorry about that. Yeah. See, they just know that we're having this broadcast. So the, it's so distracting. So the top exporters are making bank on the yen. So you've got to think that the Japanese administration, the Kishida administration, is weighing this. Who is going to be the beneficiary of the policies that we pursue? And it appears to be that the big companies, the exporters, are reaping a huge profit on exporting their goods and services. Japan, as we know, is an export-based country. What they need to be is a country that develops an economy that supports, or at least is on par with exports, but exports really support the economy here. So the reward is going to the people that are exporting cars, electronics, chips, condensers, that sort of thing. And so the fact that the automobile industry is beginning to go through this really significant shift. Instead of being the internal combustion engine using gasoline and diesel, it is going electronic. And Japan, Toyota is beginning to excel in this. It's the largest car manufacturer in the world. It is building EVs like nobody's business, but China is beginning to come up really quickly too. So eventually, if you've got a car industry that is developed on the internal combustion engine, which has, if you got the electronic vehicles, they have far fewer parts, maybe 30% of the parts that are used in terms of components and manual labor put into it. The internal combustion engine consumes 70% of that cost. So with electronic vehicles coming in, the whole industry is just going to shrink, and the high-end transmissions, the gear trains, the drivetrains, and the transmissions will all be basically disappearing because of the technology change in electronic vehicles. So that is going to impact the Japanese economy in a big way. If they're not going to be based on automobiles as they have been over the last 40 years, they've got to have a replacement industry. And that's why it was really significant in London just this last week. They had an AI summit. You might have seen that. The Prime Minister was not the Japanese Prime Minister, the British Prime Minister was there welcoming all of the delegates from 28 different countries. 33 countries signed an accord on reeling in AI. So AI is the wave of the future. I think AI is going to be that kind of component that is going to help transform the Japanese economy. We don't know right now. We never know what the future basically looks like, but we can tell that there are dynamic shifts going on right now. And this AI conference is a pretty big signal that the AI industries and producers in general, they seek regulation from the government. And it's not just the Japanese, it's not the Americans. Everybody wants more regulation over this new industry that is beginning to grow. And so if you're a follower of Donald Trump and his philosophy on how government should be regulating, the less government, the better. Just stay out of my business. Let the invisible hand guide the economy. Let profits dictate decisions by the captains of industry. That whole philosophy seems to be going by the wayside, and it turns out that the immediate future looks like more and more and deeper government regulation. So it's something that I've been keeping an eye on, and I report it to you because it's so interesting that we're going through this transformation. Sometimes you're so stuck in it, you don't realize it until you have a perspective of 3 years or 4 years in the future, and you can look back. But I think that we're in that kind of an inflection part. It looks like Biden and the Communist Party leader Xi will be meeting in San Francisco this month. They have a huge summit in San Francisco on the 15th and the 16th. So today is what, the 5th? So it's not that far away, less than 2 weeks away. It's not set in stone yet, but there has been meetings in Washington, D.C., significant meetings just this last week. And it looks like this Xi-Biden conclave will happen. It will probably be on the sidelines, but these two haven't met in a long time, not in a kind of a structured way, sometimes on the sidelines. But I think this is going to be a big one. The Chinese, what is it, the Minister of Defense made some really stark comments this last week, lambasting the United States' desire to capture and dominate the South China Seas. So there's a lot of saber rattling going on there. I think this is a precursor to having something come out. The G7 ministerial 2+2 meeting will also be in San Francisco at the same time. So the 15th to the 17th this month is working out to be a really massive diplomatic opportunity. And I think you're going to see a lot of things coming out of that. Let me see. I think that's about it. There are other things that we can talk about. I just wanted to wrap this up as quickly as possible, talk about the highlights, and then open it up for people who have questions or comments on other things that are going on. Maya?
Yes, we have some reactions about the backdrop you have. So from Richard, beautiful backdrop there. So great choice of location, Timothy. So this is, not really related to our briefing, but however, I wanted you to know. Well, thank you very much for the briefing. And I also encourage people in Clubhouse to come up and talk with us. Well, we have also a couple of questions on LinkedIn there. Then one of them is from Hiroko, and she asked, did the Bank of Japan sell US bonds this time? If you have information about this, Timothy.
I don't know the answer to that. But that's typically what they do if they need the cash. And people are scratching their heads about what the Prime Minister said. You know, you're going to be giving cash handouts, you're going to increase the defense, but where does this money come from? And it is true that the Japanese government holds massive amounts, and Japanese people in general hold massive amounts of U.S. securities and U.S. bonds, because the rate of return is much higher than what you can get in Japan. So I think probably selling off a lot of these bonds is a good way to recapture that. It scares the hell out of the United States, because if Japan and China decided to distance themselves from purchasing these bonds or holding these bonds, it would be a real shock to the U.S. economy.
Okay, thank you for that. And then going back to Prime Minister Kishida. So you mentioned that he's getting a lot of criticism and reservations from people within the LDP. And we also know that, well, a couple of weeks ago when we talked about a possible snap election, well, your take at that time was that there was no opportunity for that before the end of the year. How do you see this possibility at the moment?
That's an interesting question. It's actually a recurring question, isn't it? We get this all the time, and the Prime Minister gets this all the time. He was in the hot seat and somebody asked him again. So, Prime Minister, what do you think about holding a snap election? I mean, you're passing this extraordinary budget, and people should be really happy with you. What are your thoughts on potentially holding a snap election? And the underlying theme of that question is the Prime Minister wants to continue to be Prime Minister this time next year. So the LDP election for President of the LDP is in September of next year. So he's got to do something. If he just holds course, the likelihood of him being reappointed as President of the LDP and thus Prime Minister is zero, especially in today's kind of context. So he needs to do something, and if he holds a snap election and the LDP does as well as if it's on par with where it is right now, people will criticize him and say, you didn't need to do it, you didn't achieve anything. So he needs to really increase the standing of the LDP, either by a coalition with Komeito, and Komeito does really well, or that they accept some other political party, which is currently in opposition, into the LDP so that they can maintain a majority in the upper house and the lower house. In a snap election, of course, the upper house is not going to be affected. The lower house is going to be affected. But as you know, in Japanese politics, it's the lower house that really carries most of the weight. So it's unlikely that should he hold a snap election before the end of this year, that the LDP will increase in numbers. And in fact, if he's going to hold the extraordinary diet session until the 13th of December, he doesn't have much time to hold an election, a snap election, before the end of the year. So that's out. So he's not going to hold a snap election during the extraordinary diet session. He would be criticized for that, for using the political process to maybe jack up his approval. It's not going to work. And then on December 13th, the emperor will close down the diet, and we'll go into Christmas and New Year's. And then the constitutionally mandated new diet session will start probably around the 15th of January, go for 150 days. And it's unlikely that there will be a snap election then. They have to pass the budget on April 1st. So that's what they will be working on. And so it's possible that maybe after April and into the remainder of the diet session, they could have a snap election. But the more pregnant likelihood is after that diet session ends and they go into recess, that there would be a snap election. A lot's going to happen between now and then, but I don't think the vectors are really shaping up well to enhance the standing of the prime minister. As we talked about him kind of flipping off the tax council and coming up with his own recipe for how to rescue the economy, it really made people angry, because this, I mean, it's just unwise to disregard what the tax council is going to say. It's very powerful. It's full of a lot of very powerful bureaucrats in the Ministry of Finance. So once you start losing the love of these kinds of people within the government, I think your days are numbered. So who knows what's going to happen? Long-winded answer, but I hope it's as complete as possible and accurate. You're going to turn on your mic one of these days. I know it. I feel it.
Okay, I'm sorry for. Well, I'm trying to keep to save your ears, so that you don't suffer from unnecessary background noise on my side. But okay, so thank you for that. And then also, okay, so probably there won't be a snap election. So Hiroku-san, she commented that, well, she said, I heard on the news that this cabinet and the LDP members don't want him to dissolve the lower house, as they know there is no chance to win the snap election now. Yes, thank you very much for the comment, Hiroku-san. And well, but I also know that, as you mentioned, he's gradually losing the love of the LDP members, the support of the bureaucracy and so on. And then well, okay, my question is, if he continues, to be prime minister until next September, until the general elections, and then at that point he will also have to run for the presidency of the LDP. Yep. And we know that there are a couple of other candidates there. So what are the dynamics there? Of course, it is still a year away from now, but can you give us a little bit of foresight?
Sure. So, yeah. So frequently when people get into conversations about the prime minister and who's going to replace the prime minister, you always hear the same thing over. Well, he's prime minister now, and there's really nobody that kind of matches his charisma and his posture as prime. They always say that. And the fact of the matter is, there's a whole lot of people. And if you ask Mr. Motegi, he would impolitely say, I'm ready for the job. And Kono Taro, even though it is probably impolite, he would definitely say it. He said it in the past, gotten himself into a little bit of trouble by saying, I think I would make a great prime minister. That doesn't garner a lot of support, especially since he's a cabinet official. So being in the cabinet means you have to keep your mouth quiet and you have to support the prime minister. So it's hard for you to begin to generate kind of a momentum to be a candidate for prime minister. All of that stops, number one, if you're not in the cabinet, if you're not a member of the prime minister's cabinet. And so there's one Mr. Hayashi, who was the foreign minister until he just was replaced in the recent cabinet shuffle. He's a great candidate for prime minister. He hasn't promoted himself like that, but he was a great foreign minister, and he is number 2 in the Kishida cabinet. And strangely enough, he left the cabinet, and now he is working outside the cabinet in his prefecture, so that when he changes from the upper house to the lower house, he can run for prime minister. So it's a smart move. The prime minister always comes from the lower house, and so there are people who aspire to become prime minister who make that move if they're in the upper house. Probably Mr. Seko is also a candidate for prime minister coming from the Abe faction. He has made no moves to that, and I think probably his position as the number 1 LDP member within the upper house is probably good enough for him. I don't know, people have different appetites, but I think he's probably good where he is. You got Mr. Motegi, who is clearly angling for the prime minister's position. He is number 2 in the hierarchy. He is the Secretary General of the LDP. So you have the prime minister, you've got the cabinet, you've got the LDP. So these are the kind of the 3 power bases. And he is leading that one. And you might remember that in the recent cabinet reshuffle, the prime minister was sure to put somebody from his faction into Mr. Motegi's operation, so that he can watch what's going on there. He can report daily to the prime minister what Mr. Motegi is doing. So he's Mr. Motegi is grateful for the appointment, but he's, his faction is larger than Mr. Kishida's faction. And the fact is that Mr. Taro Aso, who is the vice prime minister, he used to be the foreign minister, as you might recall. This triumvirate between the prime minister, Mr. Aso, and Mr. Motegi, there should be a 4th person in there. There should be somebody from the Abe faction, but Abe faction is having its own trouble, and so it's a triumvirate. It's not 4 people. So that puts Mr. Aso in a key position to kind of keep things smooth between these 2 guys, because they don't like each other. They don't work very well. Mr. Motegi is not known as a very gracious or kind person, especially to those that he feels haven't done their homework or are less than worthy of the positions that they hold. So he's a real tough cookie. He has some people that like him and some people that don't like him, even within his own faction. And you'll also recall that within his faction is Miss Obuchi, who suddenly came up and was inserted into the LDP hierarchy too. So she is the election committee chair. She hasn't received a lot of criticism for this election we had 2 weeks ago, where the LDP won 1 race in Nagasaki and lost 1 race for the upper house in Tochigi. She hasn't received a lot of criticism for that, but her father was prime minister, and I think she's probably a candidate for prime minister, although she's got a little bit of a colorful history with destroying documents when she was criticized for election campaign violations. You've got Konotara. He had a fabulous Benkyokai just this last week. Maybe 400 people joined. This was on a Thursday night. Boy, he had a lot of people speaking on his behalf. The prime minister wasn't there, but there were almost 8 members of the cabinet were there to speak on his behalf, came and gave him a little bit of a congratulations, and then he spoke for 15 or 20 minutes. He's definitely a candidate that's not going to go away until he becomes prime minister. And I predict that at some point in time, he will be prime minister. He's definitely prime ministerial material. And there are several others who will come up. Takaichi will probably be there. She spoke on behalf of the digital minister as well. I would expect there to be at least 4 candidates when this comes up, when this opportunity comes up. If there are only 3 candidates, you have one kind of election. If there are 4 candidates, you have a different kind of election. So the fact that the number of candidates for the presidency really begins to impact things, and it begins to split the votes too. So yeah, I think that's a good response to the question. It doesn't really respond to the fact of what's the likelihood of the prime minister succeeding himself. And if you had to call an election right now, I think a lot of it depends on who the other contenders are going to be and what kind of dirt is going to be thrown at them. But I think if the election were held today, the prime minister would not win.
Okay. Yes, thank you. And then, well, I hope that this answers also Rachel Diankov's question on LinkedIn. So, Rachel, thank you very much for asking.
Thank you, Rachel.
Yes, and then, so I have something which is probably half a joke in Clubhouse from Gerard. Talking about saving the Japanese economy, and we have a suggestion here, tongue-in-cheek, windfall tax on big exporters to solve Kishida's budget shortfall. So, because the top 10, they actually had record earnings this year. They have had that. Yes, who knows? Well, I'm not sure that will happen. Yes, Timothy.
Just to build on what Jared said, it's also not unreasonable for the prime minister to also say to the Japanese corporations that have been hoarding funds, they've been generating profits and hoarding it, not paying it out as dividends, so they're very cash rich, to force them to either pay higher wages to their employees. I mean, the employees on a global scale, the Japanese employees, typically the salaryman, has a pretty meager salary comparatively. They don't have enough of a momentum in terms of earning power to go out and buy a house, to get all of the things that make an economy thrive internally. Most of them are just kind of holding even. And I think, the prime minister could do really well. But the LDP is the party of, it's the blue chip party. It's the party of the big corporations. And you can kind of see that through what Jared has identified. But I think you could take it a step further. If they need money, there is money available. It's just not being used. All of the money that are being held by grandma and grandpa, they're not even putting it in the banks. They're hoarding it. They're holding it for a rainy day. And that over the next 20 years is this population distribution begins to shift, and that money goes back into the economy. That was what Mr. Kishida was hoping for, that somehow he had an idea to get risk-averse grandmas and grandpas and people who have retired, all this money that they generated during the bubble years and they've been holding, to put it into the economy, get a good return on investment. That investment would feed into the economy. People would get more wages, this virtuous cycle, and it just hasn't taken off.
No, it hasn't. We also know that it's not only money held by individual households, and senior households. We also know that quite a few companies here in Japan, they have a lot of equity that is stored. Right. And the question is also, how do the politicians, how does the government actually get that money into the economy as well? And I'm not sure that there have been many policies, working in that direction so far, or have there been any at all?
Well, take a look at what's going on with the new Bank of Japan governor, Mr. Ueda. So he was, surviving, after the last Bank of Japan. You've got to be somewhat in awe of what he did over 10 years as Bank of Japan governor. You're new to this job. You're not even a bureaucrat. You're a university academic, and to come into this position. So he's a little bit timid, trying to check things out and how things were done, and move very slowly. And you could see this last week that he tweaked a little bit, and the impact was really huge. So I think he's kind of learning that, these small little tweaks have a huge impact, and you got to be really careful. I think he already knew that. But the other thing that's kind of going on with this particular individual is he's kind of green at the job, and as a consequence, there are lots of leaks that are coming out that were never acceptable or allowed in the previous administration. So leaks are coming out of the Bank of Japan administration for what movements are going on with the yen or with the currency, with what's going on with the yields, that sort of thing. So he's being hammered a little bit in that regard too. But I think the question that you've asked is, how can the Japanese government do anything that really triggers the economy? And that's the whole fight that's been going on with Mr. Kishida. And he's found out, like Mr. Ueda has found out, that these small little tweaks, let's try and do something so that we provide more support for mothers who have like preteen children. We give them a little bit more. The repercussions of that is really large, and just doing what he's suggested now in this extraordinary budget proposal, I mean, it's a huge amount of money. They've got to pull it out of somewhere. Where is he going to get it? And does the Japanese public believe that he says this, but he doesn't back it up with meaningful ways of how he's going to pay for it? So I think he's got hell to pay this next week in explaining that. But I think everybody's asking the same question, Maya. How can we generate, you know, the vibrancy that we once had in the Japanese economy? It used to be electronics, and then they offshored it. They sent the manufacturing and the IP overseas because they could create it cheaper, and then the Japanese consumer could buy it cheaper, and they didn't have to build it. And so the revenue model was generating global revenue for the Japanese companies, but the IP and the manufacturing was no longer in Japan. The same thing, I think, is going to happen with automobiles. And that's why AI and what's going on with TSMC in Kumamoto and Rapidus in Hokkaido, I think this new movement, this new industry is, it seems to me it's going to be in chips and condensers and high-end wafers, that sort of thing, and also AI. You've noticed that the Tokyo Motor Show is now called the Mobility Show. It's not called the Motor Show anymore. It's called the Mobility Show. And I think what Toyota is also pursuing now is that transportation is a service. It's not like a commodity. They're moving into a completely different way of thinking about, you know, how services are provided, and self-driving cars. And if you buy a car, you might park it in your parking lot, or maybe you have a garage, but it is capable of driving itself, or being driven by somebody else who pays a fee. And so the utilization rate of cars that are being purchased now with EV and AI capabilities, it doesn't sit in your garage all the time. It's a commodity that can be used because it's a service that is being provided. So you pay less for the car that you're purchasing, you share it more people enjoy it. The utilization of cars in Japan increases, but the number of cars decreases. You've got to figure out that that's going to have a huge impact on a car-based economy like Japan. They've got to come up with something else. I think it's going to be AI. I think it's going to be chips and condensers, but that doesn't impact everybody. That doesn't impact the entire economy. So there's still a lot left to be figured out there.
No, it doesn't, and we still have, a very strong competitor in the face of China. So who knows what happens on the way forward? And definitely, as you mentioned earlier, the government is going to, let's say, influence the economy and the industry with more and more policies that will support the new industries as well. Yes, and Mario. Yes, okay. So Mario shared a little bit of information about the inheritance tax. So basically, it is that they changed the inheritance tax. So gifts of 1 million per year are taxed 7 years after the donor's death. Currently, it is 3 years. So they are indirectly asking recipients to spend the money they receive in order to avoid inheritance tax. Thank you, Mario. Yes.
Yeah, spend it while you're alive.
Yes.
Giving it to your grandkids, it's going to incur a bit of a tax. And this is something that's happened in Japan for such a long time, that when grandma died, an eldest son was supposed to take care of grandma and grandpa, and then they died, and now he has the house. He's supposed to pay the taxes on that. And that's why, in the past, every reasonable Japanese house had a garden in it. And very few Japanese houses have gardens anymore, because the eldest son, now that he's strapped with the taxes, he destroys the garden. He puts up another apartment or another house there. He sells that. He's able to pay his taxes, and then he continues to live in this old dilapidated house. And, eventually his son doesn't want to have that. So it's a vicious cycle that has created the Tokyo neighborhoods to be the way they are now. You pull a car into a garage, and the front end sticks out because there's a tax impact of having a garage that can hold a whole car. So they get the tax deferment by having a garage that holds just half the car, and so you have half the car sticking out of the garage. So it's just crazy.
Okay, thank you for that. So we have a couple of questions on LinkedIn from Richard Woughton. I'll read them to you. Are politicians with close ties to the Unification Church suffering, or has the scandal passed?
Great question.
Yes, let me finish, please. One of my local representatives was all over the news related to his ties with the church when this scandal broke, but his posters are still up everywhere.
Yeah. Yeah, so Unification Church, it's that story that everybody wants swept under the rug. They don't want to talk about it. They don't want it to be in the news because it was really massive, especially if you were in the Abe faction. But it's not just the Abe faction, and it's not just the former Speaker of the House. It's a lot of people who were deep into it because it's very attractive, easy money. I think it's maybe a little bit too flippant. But to have an organization that really wants to be engaged in Japanese politics, and so it's ready with donations and helping you with your elections, and all you have to do is come by and give a policy speech to our members who have collected on the third Thursday of every month. It helps the church, and we help you, and we help you get reelected, and our members. They might listen to us if we say, please donate to this guy. So it's not really an illegal donation. Individuals within the Unification Church are making those donations. The Unification Church is criticized because it's a bit heavy-handed, and it tells its members, you will do it this way. And this is the kind of donation that you should make, and being a little bit heavy-handed, and that's what led to the assassination of Mr. Abe, that the mother of the shooter was so manipulated. She gave all of the money, the inheritance that this guy was going to have, to the Unification Church. So it's not unreasonable for some members of the parliament to say, look, it was just like a lot of people that I support and I give speeches to. They're just one of them, and I didn't take any money from them. I was kind of bamboozled too. So those politicians who are not heavily reliant on the Unification Church, they probably are okay, and they've probably fessed up if they're in the LDP, because it wasn't just the LDP, but predominantly the LDP members. But there's also those members who were kind of full in, and they came out, and yes, their re-election campaigns are at risk. And the analysis is that because of their ties to the Unification Church, probably 60 members of the LDP will not be re-elected in a lower house election. They will be blamed for that. And the difference between winning and losing for these 60 is so small that losing the Unification Church votes will defeat them, because the person who they beat in the last election, they only beat by several thousand votes. This vote that was in Nagasaki just this last week, the winner won by a margin of 5,000 votes. So a very squeaky win. And that goes across the board. If the prime minister is going to have an election and they haven't cleaned up the Unification Church, there are 60 LDP members who won't be there. Then the LDP falls below the 50% majority, and now they lose all the committee chairs, they lose the direction, they lose the ability to control the Japanese political process. So it's a tough thing to do. The Supreme Court is not considering that yet. It is at the lower court. The lower court just this last week has decided that, actually, I'm not sure if they decided yet, but they're on the cusp of deciding to take away the status of the Unification Church. And then that will be, depending on what the decision is, it will be appealed to the next court. So it's just going to continue on until it goes to the Supreme Court. But it's still a very, very difficult and very sticky issue. That's why nobody really wants to talk about it.
Right. Thank you for that. We have Mario with us in Clubhouse. Mario,
Hey,
good
Mario.
morning. Hi.
Good morning, Maya. Good morning, Timothy. How are you doing?
I'm good.
Eventually, I didn't make myself clear with my comment in open house. What I lately found out is that they changed the taxation of the inheritance tax for the gifts you give to anybody. So currently, if you give somebody a gift of I think it's 1.05 million yen, it's not taxable for the person which receives it. Currently, when the donor dies, this 1 million will be taxed 3 years back. So, for example, if you receive a 1 million every year, so 3 million will be taxable income after the person dies, who gave the money. They changed this now to 7 years. So meaning if you received 7 million yen, 1 million every year, this will be taxed. So they ask the people to spend the money they receive before the person who gave them the money dies, in order that it's not taxable. It's a pretty cool move. I found out lately. And basically, they ask the people to spend the money now. So for the people to avoid to pay taxes for the money they received currently free of charge.
Thank you for the clarification. I was not aware of that change in the law.
And
Yes.
And by the way, just to add to that, Mario, you don't need to be a relative to receive that gift while the person is alive. So Mario, before you die, my address is, I think Maya has it. So please be generous, and so that way, you have less to inheritance tax to pay.
Timothy, I fully understand your point, but you have to pay taxes for that. For the 3 years, I would give you the money.
Right. So
hurry up.
It's always a pleasure to pay taxes. Paying taxes means you get money. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Mario. It was very informative. Yeah, thank you very much for that.
Just let me play off of that just a little bit, if you don't mind, Maya. One of the reasons why the foreign executives don't want to come to Japan, there are a lot of reasons. There's still the specter of Carlos Ghosn, right? And you could be arrested and then thrown in jail, and you have no ability to kind of fight the system here. But worse than that is, if you come to Japan and you have long-term residency, and you make some real good, bonus money here, and then you're sent overseas and you die when you're actually in another post, within 5 years, the Japanese tax authorities can reach out at your death inheritance and tax you there. So foreign executives that come in here, they qualify, they spend 5 years here, they travel to another place. If they should die within 5 years of leaving Japan, the Japanese tax authorities are able to reach out and grab some of that. So it's just a crazy system, but I think Japan is not alone in doing that.
No, it isn't. It isn't. Okay, we have one more hand raise. So we have Daniel. Daniel, very nice to... Okay, just a moment. Let me bring you up on stage. Very nice to have you with us again. Good morning. Can you hear me? You're on mute at the moment.
Okay. How about now?
Nice. Yes, I can hear you well. Great.
Morning. Thank you. Always a pleasure to hear from you both, and always appreciate the great updates. I just thought I'd mention briefly, as we're talking the topic of tax, it's called the exit tax, right? So if you have what's called a tier 1 visa, which is, I think, permanent residency is 1, and there's one more. If you leave Japan, you have securities assets of more than 100 million yen, then there is a tax levied, as you said. Or if you send assets overseas, if you live in Japan and you have children who go and live overseas and you send money to them, those can be taxed as well. However, slightly less well known is if you have permanent residency, you can give it up and get it back later. So I've spoken to Japanese tax advisors in Japan who work with clients who get permanent residency apply for their housing loan and then give up PR later, and they have an offshore investment account, somewhere like Cayman Islands or Puerto Rico, which has no disclosure requirements in Japan, and they can have assets offshore which never get seen by the Japanese authorities. So I know prima facie, it's a really shitty tax setup. There are definitely ways to get around this if you speak to the right people. I'm not using it personally myself, but I know that it's possible, and it's actually possible to give up PR after you get it without necessarily being questioned. So just FYI.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. Yes, obviously we haven't left Japan, so we haven't faced this challenge yet. But yes, definitely, such information is helpful to people who need to deal with such challenges here. So thank you very much, Daniel.
One other play on that, if you don't mind. Let's say you have a long-term residency here in Japan. You've exceeded 5 years of building your network and your wealth here. At the end of 5 years, now you're going into a different tax bracket. And so many executives at the peak of their earning power and having been here for 5 years, they break residency. They live in Singapore or Hong Kong or someplace else for a full year. They can't come back to Japan more than half of 365 days. They break their residency and then they can come back, but it causes a hiccup in their career. I think the impact of that is so deleterious to really achieving maximum benefit for the Japanese economy. They just do things sometimes that are just so counterintuitive.
Right. Daniel,
Daniel, you're washing your hands.
Okay, so we lost Daniel, but yes, thank you. Thank you, Daniel. Yuka, good morning, or for you, it's good evening, actually. So,
yeah, good evening to you too. I'm sorry, too. Hi, Timothy. Don't ask me what my icon means because it's going to take 10 minutes. And then if you're wondering, please come to my Wednesday morning room. I may discuss there. So how
Lovely.
about that? Yeah. So going back to the weak yen topic, I happened to read this week, it's Japan Times, discussed because of this weaker yen, they may have to increase the defense budget, because when they budgeted the defense spending, I think yen was 108 or 10 yen to a dollar. Right. Now the yen is like almost a 50%. The loss of purchasing power. And my question is though, why? So the 100% of defense spendings in US dollars. In other words, that question didn't come out right. So Japan, because of our legal system or law, Japan cannot create any defense, the weapons in domestically.
No.
Is that it?
No. So Japan can create defensive weapons to its heart's content and export those. So it does that. It can't create offensive weapons, and even if it did, it can't export them. So there are a couple of valuations that the Diet has considered about offensive, if it meets 5 requirements, if it's rescue, if it's surveillance, if it's minesweeping. There are a couple of categories that if the product it is produced in Japan fits into those categories, it can be exported, but so far only to the United States. And they're trying to broaden that up because the Prime Minister wants to create a defense industry in Japan. But I think your first question is Japan relegated to purchasing in dollars those offensive materials that they can't produce themselves? And I think to a large extent, you're right. And that is because the United States provides this nuclear umbrella. Japan doesn't necessarily pay for that. They pay for it through support and facilitation. They pay for the salaries of all of the Japanese who work on the military bases and that sort of thing. But yes, they do have to purchase the Patriot missiles that they can't create. They've created a homegrown missile for defensive purposes, but the Patriots, I think, are to attack command and control centers. in the region, and they're far longer trajectory and distance. The United States has the market on that. They've closed the market. They've probably, them and the Russians have the best offensive material there. So yes, it's that. It's the radar ships, the highly advanced ships. But Japan is making, a kind of an aircraft carrier too that's capable of launching the Harrier type jets and also helicopters, so amphibious landing craft and that sort of thing. So those are made by Mitsubishi. Those are made here, but there is a component that, they do have to import, and it's a pretty large component, as you pointed out.
Okay, I'm sort of like, maybe I'm so confused, maybe, as usual. Japan need to double up the defense spending to protect, potential like attack from, neighboring Asian countries, right? And then the whole purpose is, if we need to get attacked, we can sort of attack, sort of like, fight back. That is called offense in my term, right? Is not right? Because you have to have offensive capability to be able to fend off, enemies, right? Then we have to be able to, have some sort of arsenal, like a defensive, the offense in the army base, right? Okay,
right.
Am I confused?
No, you're absolutely right. So the distinction between offensive and defensive, you can have a knife, and a knife can be considered both offensive and defensive. Even the airplanes, even the jets and the missiles, under certain circumstances, those can be considered defensive weapons. But there is a category that is truly offensive. For example, amphibious forces. Amphibious forces, the Marines in the United States, but also the self-defense forces has a component of their self-defense forces that are Marine-based, and some of that is amphibious. That means landing on islands. That means attacking, and that is almost completely considered to be an offensive type of force. So the munitions, the boats they would use, the training, the tactical experience that they would have would be kind of categorized as offensive in nature. And then there are just a lot of different kinds of weapons and weapon technology that is in the context of offensive or defensive, more offensive in nature. And as a consequence of Article 9 of the Constitution, probably the Japanese are going to say, we can't produce that. If we could produce that offensively, it only makes sense if we can export it. So having the best in the world, unless you have the best in the world, somebody else is going to be able to defeat you. So you want to have the best in the world, and if you have no ability to export your products, the amount of money that you spend on research and development is going to make it cost prohibitive. So that's why I think they rely on the United States so much to provide the air cover and the offensive capabilities, and the Japanese government just supplements it, not directly, but indirectly. But I think you put your finger on a really good point that if Japan is under attack, yes, it can defend itself, but sometimes you need more than just, you need to go to where the attack capabilities have come from. Maybe, command and control in North Korea for the missiles that have been launched towards Japan, you need to get those. It's a great question.
So, then we come back to this, the cash gift to certain household, because weaker yen necessitate, those defense budget to be increased, right? Meaning more cash from the governmental coffer. So that will reduce the money to be given out, right?
Right.
Why are they still doing this cash gift? So it's just for the political, like he wanted to just, become more popular. Is that the whole goal?
That's part of it. But also, since he hasn't been able to tamp down inflation, and he hasn't been able to encourage companies to pay higher wages, even he's made great effort, even he's increased the minimum wage, It just doesn't filter out throughout the entire economy. What he can do that has immediate effect is a cash handout. And I think that's the whole purpose there. He's been criticized for that. And as you pointed out, aren't there other ways to do that? There are other ways. He's considered those. But for example, the tax cuts and the reduction for some of the income tax reductions, those don't kick in until June or July. And what he needs is something quick, and that's a cash handout.
Yeah.
Okay, the timing issue. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Yuka. And we have one more comment on LinkedIn, Timothy, from Camilo Sandoval. Thank you very much for the comment. And it says, I was surprised to learn this summer how many Japanese-based AI tech firms will not work with the military to develop AI systems. Wouldn't AI also be used for defensive purposes?
Okay, so who asked this question?
Oh, Mr. Camilo Sandoval.
Sandoval?
Yes.
Okay, thanks for joining the briefing. And what you said is absolutely true. So this summit that they had in London, everybody was, I mean, the whole purpose there is AI for military purposes. We don't want, let's have AI for commercial purposes and for building better things, but let's not have AI for military applications. That was the core theme of this summit in London. So you put your finger right on the pulse there, that although AI is looked forward to be a market multiplier in terms of defense spending or in terms of defense accountability, they want to take AI out, because now with autonomous drones and with firepower assigned to them, yeah, it's a very dangerous thing, because it's not really controlled by humans. It's controlled by the data that has been fed into the vehicle. So that, I think, is one of the reasons. I think that has addressed your question, but if not, please come up on stage and ask it in a different way.
Yes, thank you very much for the question. Of course, we are live in Clubhouse as well. If you follow Clubhouse, or if you're a member, and even if you are not, it's very straightforward becoming a member of the house, so that we can talk directly. In the meantime, I know that Timothy, you are keen on actually going back onto your boat. And of course, we can continue the conversation next week again. For everybody who stayed with us, thanks a lot for spending this time with Timothy and me on Sunday morning during the 143rd session of Japanese Politics One-on-One. I think that Timothy is trying to show you a little bit more of the background there. Is that Hota, Timothy?
It's Hota. It's the harbor of Hota. It's full of boats and yachts, and almost everybody has left, because it's 10 o'clock, and the day, a lot of the people have already left the harbor at 5-6 o'clock in the morning as soon as the sun came up. So I'm eager to get out myself.
Oh yeah, you have to chase all the boats. Sorry. Okay, so thank you very much, Timothy, for doing the briefing from the other side of the Tokyo Bay. We're going to be here once again on Wednesday morning at 8 o'clock. We'll be talking with Richard Walton then about the dairies industry here in Japan, a very new topic for Japan Expert Insights, an exciting one as well. And also at 8:20 next Sunday morning, Japan time with Timothy Langley once again, when, yes, the topic will be Japanese politics again.
144.
144, yes, indeed. So thank you very much, Timothy. Please put your best face now, because I'm ending the live stream, and we need that smile and nice